Amen. Good morning. So there are three main times in the Gospels where Jesus asked a question and he answers it directly. Like he answers lots of questions, often through parables or displays of glory or through allegories. But there's three times where someone asks him a question and he answers it directly. And so over the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at those questions. Now, I don't know if you're anything like me, but there have been moments in my life where everything has felt completely out of control. Like life was on trial and I was losing. The summer of 2019 was one of those times. A friend who I'd had the privilege of leading to Jesus died in a horrific car accident, leaving two very young children and his wife behind. Laura's granddad died in that summer, and then someone very close to me tried to take their own life. And in the midst of all of that, I felt like everything was going wrong. And at the same time, we were expecting our third child to be born. And I thought everything was meant to chill out at those points and be ready for this beautiful baby to be born. But have you ever felt like that? Maybe you've stood in a hospital room or stared at a bank balance or read a headline in the news and thought, who's really in charge? What if I told you that the center of the Christian faith is a moment where it looked like God wasn't in control, but he absolutely was? A moment where Jesus looked defeated, but was actually declaring his kingship over all. We all want a king who looks powerful, who wins, who fixes things. And in a world like ours, where chaos seems to rule, we wonder if Jesus is really in charge. Now, there's a sociologist called Max Weber who describes three types of authority. Traditional authority, which is based on heritage or custom. It might be like fathers or grandfathers. Legal, rational, which is based on systems or laws, like police or judges. And then charismatic leadership, people based on perceived extraordinary qualities. And what he surmised is that in crisis, societies tend to lead not towards traditional or legal rational leaders, but in crisis, societies lean towards charismatic leaders, people who seem powerful or decisive or in control. And Jesus is the opposite of charismatic by worldly standards. He's calm, he's quiet, and crucified. And yet his resurrection redefines charisma by eternal impact, not stage presence. And in pop culture and politics, we often project a messianic expectation onto celebrities, leaders, and influencers, right? And in 2019, a study was done that found that 60% of young adults in the West say they're looking for someone or something to bring order or meaning into their lives. And in the West, most sociologists note how political parties often elevate their leaders to savior status. Like, this one is going to solve it all. This one is going to sort out all the problems, only to become disillusioned when they fail to deliver. Because the thing is, we all still look for kings to fix things. We still want someone who will crucify the enemy and save our tribe. But yet Jesus doesn't play by those rules. He goes to the cross for both tribes. If you're anything like me, sometimes we sing phrases like Jesus is Lord, but sometimes live like he's just an idea or a religious mascot, or we're fans rather than followers. And as you'll know, there's this theory of cognitive dissonance, which explains how we live with contradictory beliefs or actions. Many Christians might say Jesus is Lord, but struggle to align their lives with his teachings, especially his humility or nonviolence or sacrificial love. And this gap often gets filled with cultural ideas of power or money or control, even when we say we follow the crucified king. And that's what this guy Pontius Pilate did. He couldn't imagine a possible kingdom that did not look like Rome. And many modern Christians can't imagine a king who doesn't look like a CEO or a celebrity. The world back then wasn't so different. When Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" it wasn't a polite question. It was a power play. He wanted to know, are you dangerous? Are you political? Are you worth crucifying? And Jesus replies, "You say it so." But I'm jumping ahead of myself, so let's open our Bibles to Luke 22. Jesus has just been arrested and is now being thrust ahead of the only person who can authorize a crucifixion, Pontius Pilate. We're going to read from verse 66 of Luke 22 to 23:3. It says this: "At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together. And Jesus was led before them. 'If you are the Messiah,' they said, 'tell us.' Jesus answered, 'If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." They all asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He replied, "You say that I am." Then they said, "Why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips." Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now Pilate represents power and violence and control, and Jesus stands in front of him bloodied and silent, accused of being a king. And on the surface, it looks like Jesus is the one on trial, but Luke flips the script. It's actually Pilate here who is being tested. Jesus is the true judge in this instance, the true king. And he replies in this phrase, this Greek phrase, "Sou logeis," which means "you say it." Now, every single gospel refers to Jesus saying this. Matthew 27:11, Mark 15:2, Luke 22:70, Luke 23:3, John 18:37. Here, it's not Jesus denying it. He's affirming it. It's a quiet challenge. He's saying, you've said the words, but do you understand what they mean? Now, Jesus is refusing to be denied by Pilate's categories of kingship, or even our own, because he stands before Pilate, a different kind of king. Not one who crushes his enemies, but who loves them. And so what does it mean for Jesus to be our king? I was in the gym just this week chatting to a guy who works out at the gym, and he watches our videos and listens to our podcasts. And he said something along the lines of, "It's really great you're religious. I really like religious people. All religions are the same, aren't they?" No. What does it mean for Jesus to be king? If Jesus is king, it means all others aren't. So one thing that makes Jesus king, having Jesus as king means that we treat enemies differently. In Matthew's gospel, it says this, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." This was completely countercultural in first century Jewish and Greco-Roman settings. This is not about tolerance. It's a call to active love, prayer, and non-retaliation. It's rooted in the nature of God. Jesus says in Matthew 5:45 that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. And so Jesus here isn't offering like a general moral principle. He's revealing what it looks like to be God's image. You can't follow Jesus and bear grudges and hold on to bitterness and be unforgiving. It doesn't make sense, and all it does if you try to do that is it creates inconsistencies internally and can lead to anxiety and inner pain. Is this teaching unique to Christianity? Yes, it is. Totally, fundamentally unique to the teaching of Jesus. Here's some differences. In Judaism, even as Jesus grew up a Jewish lad, the Torah commands, love your neighbor as yourself. But in the Old Testament, enemy was usually interpreted to mean foreign oppressors, not personal enemies. Now, some rabbinic traditions allowed the hatred of enemies. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls, called the War Scroll, which sounds great, says this, love the sons of light and hate the sons of darkness. Now, Jesus flips this later on. He says this, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He directly contrasts popular religious thought of this day. And in Islam, the Quran encourages forgiveness and in some verses, kindness to enemies. It says, repel evil for what is better. However, loving enemies as a spiritual imperative is not centrally taught within Islam. Islamic teaching balances mercy and justice and often allows for retribution. In Christianity, when you follow Jesus, loving your enemies is a non-negotiable. It's central to the teaching of Jesus. It's how we imitate the cross of Jesus. In Buddhism teaches compassion for all beings, including those who harm you, but it's all about your own detachment, letting go of your anger, seeking inner peace for yourself. But it lacks the personal, sacrificial, relational dynamics seen in Jesus' command. He says this in Luke 6:27, but to you who are listening, I say, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. And in Buddhism, the idea is you love your enemies to free yourself from suffering. But in Christianity, you love your enemies because Jesus died to set you free and them free. Completely unique to Jesus' teaching. Because it's rooted in God's nature. That's why Jesus says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. It means let's try loving like God loves. Not with abstract compassion, but concrete, real love that takes up time, energy, thought space, heart space, and passion. Ultimately, it's demonstrated at the cross of Jesus. Jesus is different from Pontius Pilate as he reigns not on a throne built by violence, but on a cross carried in love. Jesus loved his enemies in real time. On the cross, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. It's not idealistic, it's embodied on the cross. And ultimately, it's central to discipleship. Paul echoes this. He says, while they were still enemies, Christ died for us. While we were still enemies of God, Christ died for us. He says this in Romans 12:17-21. This is Paul speaking. Do not repay evil for evil. If your enemy is hungry, feed them. And ultimately, it defines the church's witness. The early Christians were known for forgiving their oppressors, forgiving their persecutors, praying for their emperors who killed them, and refusing violence even when it cost them their lives. Now, Tom Holland, the historian, not Spider-Man, although he is great, argues in Dominion, the book that he wrote, that Christian enemy love reshaped Western morality. He writes this: the notion that the poor and weak might have a value the strong did not is profoundly Christian. The command to love enemies was a revolution in moral imagination. So apart from loving our enemies, what else is unique about Jesus' kingship? Well, ultimately, Jesus' sovereignty is one that does not flinch in chaos. And this cuts against every natural instinct. When kings are threatened, or when bosses are challenged, or when you feel unsteady, we want to assert power. When leaders are falsely accused, they speak up. They defend themselves. They get the lawyers in. But Jesus does not flinch. He doesn't panic. He doesn't even speak up initially to defend himself. And this is where Isaiah 53 comes in. It says this in Isaiah 53. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. This was written 700 years before Jesus, and yet it prophetically describes the exact posture that Jesus takes before Pilate and Herod and the Sanhedrin, the lawyers of the day. He was oppressed and afflicted. Jesus was unjustly accused, beaten, and mocked. He did not open his mouth, and this is a shock. He doesn't defend himself. The same one who has calmed the storms, who has set demons free, who raised Lazarus from the grave, all with the sound of his voice, now decides to be quiet. Like a lamb to the slaughter, he goes willingly, not like a victim, but with a deep sense of purpose. Now, why does he stay silent? Well, he's fulfilling the prophecy by choosing silence. Jesus consciously stepping into Isaiah's vision of the suffering servant. This isn't weakness, it's intentional obedience to the Father. His silence becomes louder than any possible defense. His stillness screams, I'm exactly where I'm meant to be. And now he's choosing the cross, not avoiding it. Jesus isn't cornered. He's committed. He's already settled this in Gethsemane as he says to his Father, not my will be done, but yours. He doesn't flinch before Pilate because he's already bowed before the Father. And also he's exposing false power. Pilate, in this moment, thinks he is in charge. And so do the soldiers, and so do all the lawyers around him. But Jesus' silence actually puts them on trial. It exposes the shallowness of human power. As he says in John 19, verse 11, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Now we're trained to think sovereignty means strength, success, force, and victory. I mean, we've seen powers in the world do their military parades with tanks and rockets, but Jesus shows us a different kind of power. power that doesn't retaliate, power that endures shame, power that lays itself down for enemies, power that lets death do its worst and still walks out of the tomb. The cross is not the absence of Jesus' power, but the proof of it. If Jesus only looked powerful on the mountain or in miracles or in resurrection, we might assume that God is only sovereign when we're winning. But because he's silent in the trial, because he is mocked in the palace and broken on the cross, we now know that God is still king even when everything else feels like chaos. Even in the midst of pain, he is still king. Even when our world is falling away from us, he is still king. Even when it feels like the worst thing is happening to us, he is still king. So what about you? What does it mean when you say Jesus is Lord? Because the thing is, Pilate said something that is true, but he didn't understand it. He didn't want a king who would disrupt his comfort or threaten his power, and maybe deep down we don't either. But here's the thing. Jesus' sovereignty demands a response. You're either bowing to him or ignoring him. And the good news is this, that this king rules with grace. He laid down his life for rebels like Pilate, for thieves like the one next to him, and for sinners like us. So is Jesus king in your life? Will you trust him in the chaos, not just when it's calm and sunny and rosy? And maybe for some, it's the first time you need to confess Christ as Lord today. But for others, it's time to surrender the control that we've been clinging to. Imagine if we were a church that didn't flinch in chaos because we follow a king who never has. A people who live like Jesus is truly Lord, not just on our own lips, but in our lives. What would that mean for how we face pain? Well, instead of asking, where is God in the midst of this pain, or feeling like pain must mean you're out of God's will, or we seek quick escape or distraction or bitterness in the midst of pain, we start to practice endurance with trust, like Jesus before Pilate. We start to pray honestly, like Jesus in Gethsemane. We start to serve others even when we're suffering, like Jesus on the cross is asking for forgiveness for those who have hurt him. It looks like someone who's battling anxiety, still walking into their midweek group and saying, I don't feel okay today, but I know Jesus gets this because he doesn't flinch at the cross, so I'm just going to show up today, not because I feel strong, but because he is. How does it change how we think about politics? If Jesus didn't play Caesar's power games, then neither should we. Instead of needing our political party to win, to feel like God is still on the throne, or demonizing the other side, or attaching our faith onto a political tribe, we practice courageous clarity without partisanship. We look for peaceful witness in the public spaces, and we always throw our allegiance onto Christ over a political party. Why? Because his kingdom is not of this world. So if you're a Christian on social media, you've got to be thinking, well, I care deeply about justice and truth, but I will not dehumanize those I disagree with, because my king taught me how to love my enemies, not mock them. How does the sovereignty of Jesus change how we think about money? If Jesus gave up everything to love us, then our money isn't for building our own empires. So instead of hoarding money in fear or measuring success by how much we accumulate, or giving out of guilt, we practice radical generosity, not because we have extra, but because he is enough. We practice simplicity. We don't need to impress or inflate status. We invest on the things of the kingdom because we give to what lasts. So it looks like a couple reworking their budget, cancelling a second holiday so they can give more to a refugee ministry or help a single mum in the church. What would it mean for how we handle our time? Well, if Jesus laid down his time for others, often being interrupted, then so should we. Instead of filling our lives with busyness to feel important, or guarding our time as if it's our own, or avoiding people who feel like they waste our time, we practice presence over productivity. We create margin for mercy. We leave room in our calendars for people who are in pain. We rest properly. We trust that the world won't fall apart if we take a day off. It looks like a teenager giving up their Friday night to sit with a grieving friend, or a church member saying no to overtime so they can help at Thursday night youth. And finally, what would it mean for how we handle status and power if Jesus is king of our lives? If Jesus did not cling to status, as we learn in Philippians 2, then neither should we. So instead of climbing ladders in the corporate world, or competing for recognition, or needing titles or applause, we look for how we can serve below our station, like Jesus washing feet. We look for how we can celebrate other people's success, or we look for ways that we can choose humility even when we could demand respect in different ways. It looks like a business owner taking time each week to clean the office kitchen as they pray for the team, not to be noticed, but because the king washed feet. It looks like you stepping back to letting a teenager have a go at what you do, even though it may not be as polished or great. If Jesus is the kind of king who doesn't flinch when falsely accused, if he doesn't retaliate when struck, and doesn't flex when he could, then his people, us, we are called to live in that way too. In politics, in money, in time, in power. This is not weakness. It's the upside down power of the kingdom. It means we do not panic. We are people of peace, the kind of peace that makes no sense. We don't manipulate. We don't bow down to Caesar and the powers of this world. We trust the crucified King, because when the world looked at him and saw defeat, heaven sees victory, and he is still on the throne today. And so we're going to pray. You might want to pray in different ways today. You might want to respond in a number of ways. Maybe you've never said to Jesus, I want you to rule my life. I want you to be enthroned. I want you to be the king of my life. I want to live my life like that is different. And we'd love to give you the opportunity to do that today. But maybe you've been a Christian a few years, and maybe you've let other things take that throne. Maybe you let other things take your attention. Maybe you let other priorities take up the top one. And today, God's giving you an opportunity to get before him, to bow to him in your heart and say, I'm sorry, I want to follow you afresh, be king of my life.